me to come on video. Let me just check my settings. Let me just rejoin 1 second.
Okay, yeah, I needed a complete list of who's supposed to be here.
I texted that to you, Claire. Maybe.
I got the speakers, but then I didn't know who all is supposed to be joining from the organizer side. And I do not see Jamie yet.
Claire, so I'm being told that please don't eliminate anyone from the list because they are the interpreters. So the ones that are currently listed as panels, they should be retained in that list.
Okay.
We're just waiting for Jamie. He's going to join now.
Hi, can you hear me okay, Luis?
We can hear you. I guess your camera is not well positioned right now.
Yes, I'm sorry. I normally put my camera down. Yeah, sorry about this. I haven't even combed my hair this morning. I didn't realize I was moderating until recently. How many people we have? This is a nice small group of expert people. So I think this is going to be good. Luis, you have to give me some guidance because you're calling me at the last minute as a moderator. So we have like 4 speakers, is that correct?
We have 4 speakers. I think 10 to 12 minutes for each speaker is a nice time.
And what's the order?
So I'll start, and then Sane, and then Catherine, and then Professor Sanpat.
And then okay, that's good. So now I understand you have some slides. Is that correct?
I do, yeah.
Do people, just for people that are joining the thing, Luis works for Knowledge Ecology International. He works with us. He's has a law degree your law degree is in the Dominican Republic, right?
That's correct.
And he's studying for a PhD in the law in Argentina at the University of Buenos Aires?
Yeah.
And he works in Washington, D.C. And he's one of the persons that along with Catherine and Claire Cassidy, which take a deep dive on government funding of different technologies. And he's going to present some of the work he's done on COVID. Go ahead, Luis. Are you going to be sharing some slides?
Yeah, I'll try to, let me see if I can do it now. I think it should be, can you guys see the slides now?
Yes.
Okay.
I can see the slides. Yeah, that's fine.
And can you guys hear me okay, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Absolutely.
I need to move this because I don't see. Okay. So I'm going to be talking about failure to disclose government interest in patents. This is work that, as Jamie mentioned, we've been doing at Knowledge Ecology International. So the Bible Act requires contractors, that is normally universities and companies that get money from the U.S. government, to disclose the fact that they receive government money in their patents. So think that what is normally called the government interest statements in patents. And these disclosures are an important policy tool because they inform the public about the role of the US government in the research and development that led to a particular invention or a set of inventions. And they provide federal agencies and the public in general with a better understanding of the rights that they might have around this publicly funded patents. And so things like marching rights, which is something that KI has been heavily involved with, or free royalty-free uses, we know that a particular patent is subject to those provisions if there is a government interest statement. At least that's the easiest way to know. And yet contractors often fail to disclose this government interest statement in their patent. There has been research about this in the US by the GAO office, a report from the late 90s, and then a follow-up report in 2003, work around this issue of failure to disclose. And Professor Sampat, along with Artie Ray, who is here with us in the panel, has been has made critical empirical contributions to this field too. Obviously, I'm not going to mention his research. I suspect that he might address KEI and among advocacy groups have done all of the work or most of the work, I think in the US and for what it's worth globally around failure to disclose. Since a few years ago, we have done several requests around several technologies that we think fail to disclose this government interest statement. I will make another point, which is that it's a problem not only to never disclose government interests in patents, but it's also a problem to do this very late and throughout certificate of corrections. And the reason why there's two main reasons why this is a problem. Number one, it's very hard to find these patents with government interest statement in certificate of corrections, basically because the USPTO do not have a search keyword for patent that disclose throughout certificate of corrections. So it's very hard to find them. This is something that arguably the USPTO can fix, but they haven't done it yet. And the other problem is that this certificate of corrections tend to happen very late, several years after the patent has been initially filed. And so what you're seeing currently in the slide is a work that I've been data that I've been working on recently, which shows that indeed certificate of correction discloses government interest tend to happen on average about 9 years after the patent application was initially filed. So if we agree that the purpose of having this government interest statement is to have a better understanding of the rights and the role of the US government, and that we never know or we know very late about this role, then probably the public interest is not being served appropriately when these disclosures are made through certificate of correction. I will come back to this issue of certificate of corrections at the end of my presentation. And so how at KEI, how do we do this research when we are trying to figure out whether there was a failure to disclose government interest in patents? So we start typically by identifying patents that lack government interest statement, either in the text of the patent or the certificate of corrections, which is what I just mentioned. And then we try to build, as much data as we can about this patents to try to put them in a context, if you will. And typically we do that by getting the priority dates, the name of the inventors, information about the technology, so the claims, the abstracts, the title, and anything else that would allow us to better understand what was patented in this occasions. And then we go out and look for the academic literature for papers that are related to the technology that was patented. We also look into the NIH reporter, and in cases when the company is publicly traded, we look into the SEC forms, and quite frankly, everything that we can find around, that will give us information about the role of the U.S. government around a particular technology, so that we can better, we can then compare the two, the patents and the evidence of government support. And if we see a correlation, then we think we have a failure to disclose here. And so we sometimes have proceed with reports and requests to the federal agency to correct and to adopt remedies around this failure to disclose. So in the case of Moderna, in the COVID-19 context, we started by looking into all of the patents that this company has obtained from the beginning of times until August of this year. And we found 126 patents assigned to this company. Not a single one of this patent, not even one, discloses government interest, which is quite remarkable, because if you've seen the news, you probably know that this company in the US, this company has received quite a lot of funding from the U.S. government. I think other co-panelists here, Catherine and Zane, are gonna be talking about BARDA and the NIH. I will be talking about DARPA, which is another federal agency that has also funded Moderna, and I think it's the one that started earliest in their partnership with Moderna. So if you Google, if you search for Moderna in the DARPA website, one of the first things that you will find is this, picture, which very clearly explains that, they think that they have a role, they play a role in the development of their mRNA technology platform, which is what Moderna is using for the COVID-19 vaccine. So very clearly a role there. If we go to the SEC forms relating to Moderna, then we can get more information about things like the number of the contracts that they have with DARPA, when this contract started, which is very important to understand, what patent might be involved, and things like the amount of money that was allocated or directed to Moderna, and also information about the field of the technology. In this case, the mRNA technology platform, which is what they have been using in the COVID-19 candidate. If we look at the literature, the academic literature, we find at least 2 papers that was co-authored by Moderna scientists. And so we now know, and this papers discloses government funding from DARPA, and they relate to the chikungunya vaccine and the Zika virus vaccine, but both of them uses the mRNA technology platform. So now what we have is information, by looking at these sources, we know that Moderna indeed has been funded by DARPA. We know when this relation started, more or less, and we know which inventors actually worked on the DARPA funding. So now we can go back and look at the Moderna's patent portfolio and identify which patents are related, potentially related to the DARPA funding. And what we found was that at least 21 patents indeed name such inventors that receive funding or acknowledge funding in papers. And this patent were filed after the contracts with DARPA started. So we think that there's a failure to disclose in those cases. And that's what we requested DARPA to investigate. We've released a report and made a request to DARPA in late August 2020. On the very same day, it was covered by the Washington Post and then by the Financial Times. I should say that the Financial Times also has a pretty important quote from DARPA confirming that as a reaction, immediately reacting to our request and launching an investigation around the Moderna patents, which was very important and quick. And other news sources also cover the story. These are a few of them. Senator Van Hollen, who is one of the co-sponsors of the We Pay Act, also tweeted about the research and the requests. This is cool because he proposes in the We Pay Act to take provision to adopt provisions around failure to disclose. I can talk about them later if people are interested. And 3 weeks after our report, DARPA directly confirmed to KEI that indeed they were investigating the patents that we think failed to disclose government interests. The next day after DARPA, when the stock market opened, it seems that DARPA lost some stock value. At least this is what experts in the stock market believe. I wouldn't know that much. People believe it's because of the report that we published and the potential that DARPA could take title or at least has a stake in the patents. So I'll conclude with the remedies and saying this. If funding agencies never take title of patent that failed to disclose government funding, regardless of the facts, doesn't matter what happened, then they will be sending a signal to the companies, which is you can do better little to disclose government funding, because the worst that can happen is that you're going to have a bad PR day, and then maybe lose some value in your stocks, which you could probably recover later. And then in the worst case scenario, the agency might ask you to correct the record, which, like I said, could happen many years after the patent has been filed. So this is what we think that the agencies should send a message, which is to take title of the patents, and not only simply allow the contractors to correct the record with a certificate of corrections. I'll stop here, and I look forward to your comments and to the other presentations.
Louise, I have several questions, and I think others might too. But it's now 10 minutes to 11. Do you know when the session ends?
I think it's 11:40. We have, and I can confirm that.
Right.
Now.
So since is it 11:40? Is that correct?
11:50.
11:50. Well, given the fact that we have 1 more hour and 3 more speakers, what I'd like to do is move ahead with the other 3 presentations, and then engage in comments initially among the panelists, and then from people that have added things in the chat. So next up, we have Catherine Artizone, who's a lawyer, educated at Georgetown, works for KEI in Washington, D.C. Catherine, are you online right now? Yes.
Yes.
Catherine,
Sorry, I wasn't expecting to go next. I'm just trying to find my presentation. Just one moment.
Sure. And Catherine is, some of the things that Catherine has worked on with us have been these issues about the obligations under the Bayh-Dole Act to disclose the share of funding in press releases and commentary about products that are developed, as well as the ratio of public and private funding, the use of these non-Bayh-Dole contracts, such as other transaction authority. She's also conducted a fair amount of research on specific products that she's worked with. She's worked with Zane, who will speak after her on some of these issues. Catherine, are you ready to go? Or do you want to wait until after Zane goes if you can't find your presentation?
Sorry, it's not loading right now, so I'll go after Zane.
Zane, are you prepared to go right now?
Yes, Jamie.
Okay, Zane, why don't you go ahead and, well, I should introduce Zane a bit. Zane, you're a graduate of Yale Law School, is that correct?
Yes.
And how long have you been working for Public Citizen?
About 2 years.
About 2 years. So Zane has worked in the past with Amy Krupinski at Yale on some of these issues, and he's traveled widely. He and I were in Pakistan. Was it this year, wasn't it, actually? Or maybe it was last year, I can't.
I can't remember. Last year, yeah.
Last year. And he works on a broad set of issues, but one of the areas where he has done a fair amount of work on recently has to do with COVID and funding for technologies related to COVID. Go ahead, Zane.
Well, thanks, Jamie, and thanks, KEI, for the invitation to speak. I'll try to be brief and focus on some particular issues. So I wanted to focus on kind of government support for COVID medicines. And I think one thing that's important to highlight is that the funding, there's multiple forms of support. There's the funding itself, and then there's also the intellectual contributions of federal scientists who are often driving a lot of this work. And so I wanted to take a deep dive into vaccines in particular. This is sort of the challenge. We will need more vaccines than we've ever needed before in a very quick amount of time, potentially up to 14 billion doses. we made a lot of progress. Several have entered late-stage clinical trials, and unfortunately, it's still not clear whether corporations will be willing to share their knowledge, their know-how to expand supply, even as we know that that is crucial to help vaccinating the world as quickly as possible. And so what's interesting about all this is that, there's a clear moral imperative of getting a vaccine to everyone when it's proven safe and effective to everyone as quickly as possible, is the fact that there is an enormous amount of government support that underpins most, if not all, of the leading candidates and a lot of the work that is going on. And so we have developed, and this is just focused on one US government agency called the US Biomedical Authority on Research, BARDA, Biomedical Authority Research Development, US Biomedical Research and Development Authority. BARDA. And so BARDA has been leading most of the work, but not all of the work, and it's also part of Operation Warp Speed. And so we've been tracking a little bit, where BARDA's investments are going and, what they're funding. And it includes things like both research, development, manufacturing, as well as procurement. And so the numbers are quite staggering. The US government alone has spent around $13 billion. It's a bit hard to disaggregate exactly, what is going for research and development versus manufacturing versus procurement, because sometimes the press releases sort of combine all the information. One of the interesting things you'll note in this summary is that, vaccines are getting a disproportionate amount of the attention of the US government. You can see, 83% of BARDA money is going towards vaccines. And therapeutics, including some of the therapeutics that President Trump is currently on, including Regeneron's MAB, monoclonal antibody, is getting significantly less amount of attention. And so if you check out citizen.org, you can kind of play around with the funding summary and tracker and kind of figure out who's getting what. But one thing I really want to focus on is that it's not just the funding. Funding is obviously a critical component of it in terms of what the federal government is doing to support many of the leading candidates, but sometimes it's also the intellectual contributions. And so here is something that I came across a few months ago now when I was just reading an article on the so-called Moderna vaccine, mRNA 1273. This, of course, is one of the vaccines that's furthest along in clinical development. It's in phase 3 right now. It uses a new technology that Luis mentioned called the mRNA platform. And so in that article, I think this was results from a phase 1, perhaps. And this speaks to the lack of transparency in the entire system here, is that in the scientific article, they had a section called competing interests. And in that competing interest, which is like a conflict of interest disclosure, in that conflict of interest disclosure section, the US government scientists had to disclose the patent applications that they were inventors of. And so you see 2 patent applications here. One is the pre-fusion coronavirus spike protein, and then one just is entitled 2019 nCoV vaccine. So one point worth making here is that, why is this information so hard to find? Why like do I have to stumble across it, in some random scientific paper? And why is the US government not kind of publicizing it more and talking about it? So that's kind of one, issue with transparency. The second issue, of course, is that based on those 2 applications and some other documents that Axios obtained, we concluded that basically the NIH is claiming joint ownership of the Moderna coronavirus vaccine, of Moderna's coronavirus vaccine, quote unquote. And the reason this is important and kind of the role of the US government here, I think, is worth clarifying, because it's it just helps shows what public funded science can do. So this is, the third coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2 is the third coronavirus that has really caused major concern in the world. The first 2 were SARS back in 2003, and then MERS around 2012, 2013. And US government scientists basically for the past few years have been looking into coronaviruses with a particular eye on MERS and SARS. And what they were looking at was how do we design design responses to coronaviruses, and how do we kind of analyze the specific coronavirus itself. So a coronavirus is called a coronavirus because if you look at it in a microscope, corona comes from crown. So it looks like a virus with, wearing little crowns. And the crown, each of the kind of spike is basically referring to what's called a spike protein. And so scientists have long hypothesized that the spike protein is the best antigen you can use, because that, you want to introduce something that's similar to the spike protein, because this spike protein is very distinct to the coronavirus, and scientists hypothesize that it will generate the best immune response. But the problem with the spike protein is that it is extremely reactive. And it changes shapes, and it's like a huge shapeshifter, and it goes all through all these different kind of biological processes. But the US government-funded scientists, including some scientists actually at the NIH and then others at the University of Texas, Austin, figured out a way how to stabilize the spike protein. And by stabilizing it, by keeping it in that one specific kind of formation, they made some specific amino acid substitutions. By stabilizing it, they were able to generate a better kind of immunological response for their MERS, for the MERS work they were doing. And so when this new coronavirus came around, they sort of had, this blueprint ready. They were able to rapidly deploy this technology. And this is part of the story of why the NIH/Moderna vaccine was able to be, generated so quickly. Of course, there was actual, Moderna's platform technology that helped as well. But we had this prior knowledge, we had this prior understanding, and so we didn't have to go through trial and error a billion times to figure out what the precise antigen should be. And what's interesting about this is also that, when this story first came out, Moderna was, its response was basically like, we're not aware of any kind of intellectual property that could prevent us from commercializing our product, which didn't really answer the question that we had about, what does it mean? And then we were digging through the SEC filings of Moderna, and recently the company has basically said we are not sure whether we were the first to file for the invention of mRNA 1273. And that's a pretty remarkable statement, that Moderna is essentially saying that we cannot, that there is a risk that someone else, i.e. the NIH, has may eventually critically, own a critical part of the vaccine. And this is important, again, because it goes back to the first slide I mentioned about the need to ensure that everyone around the world has a vaccine as quickly as possible. And so if the federal government does have indeed have some of these authorities, if it indeed does have some of these ownership rights, of course, it should, not exclusively license the rights to allow others to use them, but it should also do so on specific conditions, and this goes back to it's a very similar idea as the funding argument. If you're giving billions of dollars away to a company, like Moderna has received, I think about 2.5 billion now, up to 10 billion actually. But if you're giving away billions of dollars to a company, you should safeguard that investment. You should attach public interest conditions. You should require something of the corporations instead of just kind of giving away the money. And so likewise, if you have a technology and if you're allowing other companies or if you're allowing corporations to use that technology, then you should condition that the use of that technology on meeting specific parameters. And those parameters should ideally protect the public interest. And so we're talking about things like ensuring reasonable pricing, sufficient supply. We're talking about things like participating in the World Health Organization's COVID-19 technology access pool. So to require the corporations who are benefiting, not just from public funding, but from public science, to share their technology, to help scale up production, and so we can prevent treatment and vaccine rationing to the extent possible. And I conclude by saying that, and this is an excerpt from an older report, but I think what's, we've kind of dug deep into the Moderna story, and I think, Louise has talked about it and Catherine is going to talk about it. But while Moderna is unique in some ways, it's actually part of a much broader pattern in which public funding has underpinned a lot of the development of these new platform technologies that are being used to develop COVID-19 vaccines. And so there's taxpayer support really at many significant points in the development of this vaccine. And it's so critical that that funding is both made transparent. And so you shouldn't need nerds like me and Louise and Jamie and Catherine to kind of, figure out exactly how much the US government is doing. It should be publicly available. It should be, common knowledge. So it should make it transparent, and also it should attach conditions to protect the public interest. Thank you. Jamie, I think you're on mute.
Thank you, Zane. That was a very clear and informative presentation. As I mentioned before, given the time, I'd like us to do is go right to Catherine, and followed by Professor Sampat, Bob and Sampat, before we go to questions. And Catherine, looks like you've got your slides all figured out. Would you like to go ahead? First, Catherine, as I started to introduce her before, she's a lawyer like the other three speakers, actually. And she's specialized a lot on the issues about the intellectual property rights on government-funded technology since she's been working at KEI. So go ahead, Catherine, present your slides.
Thank you, Jamie. So I'm going to be talking about COVID-19 funding agreements in the United States. Conceptually, you can think of the agreements as falling into two main categories. There's the R&D contracts, and those have been mainly executed by BARDA, part of HHS, and they involve all aspects of R&D from preclinical research all the way through to FDA approval and some scaling up of manufacture. And they award hundreds of millions to $1 billion to pharmaceutical companies to develop vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics. Then there's the procurement contracts, and they're even greater awards of government funds. They range from $1 to $2 billion, and they advance purchase hundreds of millions of doses of various vaccine candidates. And interestingly, many of the contracts have been entered into by an intermediary called Advanced Technology International, and not the government itself. And I'll return to that point later. So overall, what have we learned about the R&D contracts? Well, like I said before, they range from hundreds of millions to $1 billion. Many of the agreements are other transaction agreements, or OTAs, which I'll explain in just a moment. And in some instances, the US government is paying 80 to 100% of the development costs. So now I'll talk briefly about other transactions authority. And that's an authority granted by Congress to 11 federal agencies, including NIH and BARDA, to enter into other transaction agreements. Now, federal agencies treat these agreements as freedom of contract, anything goes. Unlike with traditional government contracts, there's a standard set of rules and regulations that protects taxpayers' investments and gives the government rights in IP and data, including under the Bayh-Dole Act and Federal Acquisition Regulation. And in the view of federal agencies, these contracts are exempt from all of that, and it does not need to be included. They're like a blank slate. So here's just a few quotes about other transaction agreements, and they show that people outside the government believe that the biggest benefit of using another transaction agreement is that the government doesn't have to retain rights in IP and data, and you can avoid all of that. This is an excerpt from an NIH training document that it uses to train its contracting officers about other transaction agreements. And if you look at the middle, it says that past OTAs have included a waiver of the government license. They've allowed protections of materials as trade secrets and negotiation of a new definition of practical application. So to understand why that matters, just a brief overview of the Bayh-Dole Act. It was designed both to promote the commercial development of federally funded inventions and to protect against the non-use or unreasonable use of the inventions. And in protecting against the unreasonable use of federally funded inventions, the government retained certain rights in all publicly funded inventions, such as march-in rights, including the ability to march in if the contractor fails to make the invention available to the public on reasonable terms, which includes price, and a royalty-free license to practice the invention or have it practiced for on behalf of the United States government. And then the rights and technical data under the Federal Acquisition Regulation are summarized here. For data that is first produced in performance of a contract with the US government, regardless of how the development of the data is funded, the government has unlimited rights in that data, and that is very broad. True to its name, it's unlimited, and it can include the government transferring the data for use by a competitor. The government has limited rights in data that was developed at private expense and not first delivered under the contract. And that is unlimited inside the government, but more limited outside of the US government. So how does this relate to a COVID-19 vaccine? Well, HHS, or the Department of Health and Human Services, was issuing a lot of press releases talking about COVID-19 R&D contracts, and it said that it was using other transactions authority and expanding on pre-existing other transaction agreements to enter into COVID-19 contracts. Then under the CARES Act, Congress actually expanded the authority of BARDA and DoD to enter into other transaction agreements for COVID-19. So KEI submitted a FOIA request for the COVID-19 contracts being entered into by BARDA. And after they said that the request was overbroad, we narrowed it down to 6 contracts. In late June 2020, we got those contracts. And what we saw was that 4 of the 6 contracts were in fact OTAs, and they weakened or eliminated the government's rights in IP and data developed under the agreements, limiting the government's ability to address unreasonable prices, to authorize generic competition, and to transfer technical data. So here's a summary of the 6 contracts obtained by KEI. And as you can see, they're very high in monetary awards, ranging from hundreds of millions to almost $1 billion. And you can see the purpose of OTAs was to attract non-traditional government contractors, but many of the companies listed are traditional government contractors, such as Johnson & Johnson and Roche. So here's a summary of how the OTAs weaken the government rights in IP and data. So they redefine practical application, and that's the contractor's obligation with what they do with the federally funded invention. So under the Bayh-Dole Act, they're required to make the federally funded invention available to the public on reasonable terms. They delete the words unreasonable terms, so all the contractor is obligated to do is develop the invention and make it available to the public. They remove 2 of the 4 grounds for margin rights. They narrow or eliminate the government's royalty-free license to use the invention, and they eliminate or weaken the government's unlimited rights in data so that they're more like limited rights where the data can be used inside the government, but not outside the government. This table is a side-by-side comparison of contracts that adhere to the Bayh-Dole Act, contracts that adhere to the Bayh-Dole Act, and the definition of practical application, and then the OTAs we obtained. So you can see that unreasonable terms language has been deleted. The OTAs did generate some, or our analysis of the OTAs did generate some press coverage. And this slide is a screenshot of Chris Murphy. So there was a July 2nd, 2020 congressional hearing where members of Congress questioned the acting director of BARDA and Francis Collins, the director of NIH, about why these federal agencies would weaken the government rights at a time when the government is awarding massive amounts of money and the public interest and economic stakes are as high as you can imagine. You'd want greater rights, not weaker. So some members of Congress asked very important questions, and the response that they got from the NIH, the director of the NIH, Francis Collins, was that it doesn't really matter because the Bayh-Dole Act does not allow the government to march in and address unreasonable prices. And Chris Murphy responded that that's not actually the case, and that there are plenty of lawyers who would say that the definition of unreasonable terms includes reasonable prices. So next I'll transition to the cost sharing under the COVID-19 contracts. Because of the redactions, we don't know the cost sharing arrangements for the majority of the contracts, but we do know the cost sharing for the Moderna contract in the Regeneron OTA. So the Moderna vaccine R&D contract is for development of the joint NIH and Moderna vaccine candidate that Zane discussed, all the way from preclinical research through FDA approval and domestic scale-up manufacture. And BARDA is covering 100% of those development costs. How do we know this? Well, around the same time, Zane and I were looking at the contract that KEI obtained under the FOIA, and we saw a provision that obligates Moderna in all press releases discussing the vaccine candidate to disclose the total and proportionate funding provided by the federal government and the total and proportionate funding provided by non-governmental sources. We looked at, here's the relevant provision, just screenshotted. We looked at some Moderna press releases, or all Moderna press releases, describing the vaccine candidate, and none of them complied with this obligation. So we wrote a letter to Gary Disbrow, the acting director of BARDA, and asked that he ensure that Moderna complies with this obligation, because this is very important information that Moderna is contractually obligated to disclose. Axios and Stat News covered the story, and the former director of BARDA retweeted it, and shortly thereafter, BARDA responded. And BARDA has been pretty responsive throughout this process, and said that BARDA would look into the situation and that it values transparency and accountability to the American people. Shortly thereafter, a Moderna press release excerpted here said that BARDA is reimbursing Moderna for 100% of the allowable costs under the contract. Basically, Moderna is not putting up anything. BARDA is covering 100% of the cost of developing the joint NIH Moderna vaccine candidate. Finding out about the cost sharing in the Regeneron OTA was easier, because we just looked at an SEC filing where Regeneron itself revealed to the SEC that HHS is obligated to fund 80% of the costs incurred for research and development. And that's for Regeneron's therapeutic candidate that was just taken by President Trump. Why does this matter? Well, the fact that the government and charities are effectively de-risking companies' investments in vaccines and treatments for COVID-19 should be reflected in the purchase price of the vaccines and the terms of the funding agreements. But as far as we can tell, this is not the case. Okay, lastly, I will transition to the procurement contracts just really quickly. These are even larger awards of $1 billion to $2 billion to advance purchase hundreds of millions of doses of the vaccine candidates before they're proven safe and effective. And notably, these contracts have not been entered into by the US government. The government has entered into a contract with Advanced Technology International, or ATI, and ATI has entered into the contracts with the contractors. Here are some of the purchase agreements, and you can see the large amounts of money that have been awarded. All but the Moderna contract were executed by Advanced Technology International rather than by the US government. Now, what is Advanced Technology International? It calls itself a collaboration management firm, and it's been used by DoD since 2016 to facilitate the Medical CBRN Defense Consortium, or MCDC, which is used to develop products for DoD personnel, like I said. Curiously, like I said before, Operation Warp Speed is using ATI and MCDC to enter into COVID-19 purchase agreements for Novavax, J&J, Pfizer, and Sanofi. And the agreement between DoD and ATI to do this is another transaction agreement. So I discovered this, or was working with an NPR reporter, Sydney Lupkin, because she let me know that she had submitted a FOIA request to BARDA for the Novavax vaccine purchase agreement. And BARDA said that it didn't have a copy of the agreement, even though BARDA said that it was a party to this agreement. So she found that very strange. And we found out that Novavax in an SEC filing was saying that the contract was with ATI. So this is a snippet from, or a clip from her news coverage of this story. She asked ATI why it would be used in this manner when ATI is usually used to develop products just for DoD personnel, and these COVID-19 vaccines are for all civilians. And ATI said something like, oh, well, we already had the membership in place, so it was just easier to do this. But Novavax joined the MCDC consortium this summer, so that doesn't really hold water. Why this is concerning? OTAs lack the safeguards that were built into the government contracting process to give the government rights and IP and data and protect taxpayers. And with the pandemic, you want access as equitable and widespread as possible. You want to make sure that the government has retained certain rights in the vaccines and treatments. When an OTA and intermediary is used, it is unclear whether those rights are preserved. But the last slide is that the government can set reasonable prices. We did find a Novavax SEC filing that states as follows. It's kind of a long quote, but at the end it says that if Novavax in the United States are negotiating an extension of the contract and they don't reach an agreement, the US government has the discretion to unilaterally determine a fair and reasonable price for completion of the definitive agreement. And we found that very noteworthy because the US government usually says it doesn't have the competence to determine a fair and reasonable price. And clearly it does. I know I covered a lot of ground in a short amount of time. If you have any questions, please reach out to me.
Well, thank you, Catherine. That was a packed, informative presentation, and it was very clear. Because of the time constraint, what I'd like to do before we get to questions is I'd like to introduce Professor Bhavan Sampath from Columbia University and have him make his presentation. And then after that's done, then I think I'd like to have some back and forth among the panel members. I followed up Professor Sampath for some time. I read an early book that he wrote on the Bayh-Dole Act. He's an economist, unlike the other speakers who have a legal background. My background's in economics, and so I'm really glad that there's an economist on the panel. And he received he received actually, I think, 4 different degrees from Columbia University, if I'm not mistaken. He's spent a lot of his time working in the School of Public Health, but he's also had appointments at New York University. He's, as I did when I was younger, he's worked for the National Bureau of Economic Research, University of Virginia. I didn't work for Michigan, but he has. Georgia Tech Institute of Technology. He's published an amazingly large number of articles and chapters and books, and he's one of the world's real experts in technology transfer. So, Professor, go right ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Jamie, for that kind introduction. I hope I don't disappoint. And thanks for the opportunity to join this panel. I told Luis when he invited me that I was actually mainly interested in joining the session to learn about the amazing work that he and others at KEI have been doing beyond what I hear in the news. And I'll say this hasn't disappointed. So I actually don't have a ton original to add beyond one additional idea for identifying the government role going forward. And honestly, I think this idea may or may not work, and I wanted to introduce it now and bounce it off people who are more knowledgeable about these topics than am I. And let's see how knowledgeable I am about advancing my slides. Okay, so before diving into the idea, let me summarize from my perspective at a very high level what it is, and this is pre-COVID, what it is I think we know and the many things that we don't know on this topic of the role of the government in pharmaceutical innovation and drug development. From my sense, and this is from some of my work, but also Aaron Kesselheim, Cleary, a bunch of people over the years, over 10, 20, 30 years, that from both from the perspective of both qualitative and quantitative evidence, I think we know that for the vast majority of important drugs, maybe 70 to 100%, there are linkages or traces between government-funded research and the drug innovation. So through publications, through patent citations, qualitative research, and whatnot. For about a fifth to a quarter of important drugs, and we could talk about what that means, but just take my word for it now, we see, and I'm talking about small molecule drugs, so that's an important distinction. We see at least one patent with government interests. And again, there's 2 or 3 or 4 or 10 different papers that kind of suggest that. So that's my one set of things that I think we know. A second set of things I think we know are about the division of labor between the public and private sectors. In general, in quote unquote normal times, the government role, and I'm thinking here mostly about the NIH, is mostly upstream on so-called basic research. In most cases, even for the 20 or 25% of drugs where we do see government rights in the drug, the firms are still typically, not always, paying for the trials. So we need to think about their incentives as well. 2 notes to this, and this will transition to what I'm getting to next. First, it doesn't need to be that way. I have argued for some time that the government could avoid some of these trade-offs just by going more downstream into drug development. And we can talk about that. But second, it's not always that way, including in crises. So I've done some work on World War II, but it seems, and we saw this from previous presentations today, also now, the government's certainly not funding, it's actually not funding much at all, basic research now, though its previous quote unquote basic research is in the background, especially on mRNA and things like that. But right now it's actually quite involved downstream in development trials, manufacturing, purchase agreements and things like that. And you would expect the government, to the extent the government has a role there, you would expect the argument that it should be able to use that role to affect prices, access, and other outcomes to be much stronger in this context than in normal times. A few other things where we don't know. Actually, why don't I not go through all of these for purposes of time, but just focus on the last one because it touches on some of the things that were discussed in previous presentations. This question that Luis raised about underreporting. How would estimates of this direct role, which again, I've pinned at 20 to 25% of drugs, how would that change if we actually had accurate reporting of government grants and contracts in patents? And are there important drugs in general or in the COVID context where the government actually has rights, but we're not seeing them because of underreporting? There's various ways in which you can think about solving this problem. We've talked about some of them. I think Luis's work on certificates of correction, and I know Jamie's been doing some of that, is really promising. Two approaches that have been used, and we've heard some of them just now, are qualitative assessment of the grants and contracts out there that seem to be in the same technological space and have the same individuals or firms involved, though that's harder to do if per Catherine's presentation, we can't actually see the contracts, but that's one way to do so, which is to look at government funding in that area around the time, to the firms or inventors involved around the time a patent was developed. A second would be a qualitative assessment of publications that occur around the same time with inventor overlap, using the funding acknowledgements data that are reported in publications, but not always in patents. And so my idea, my modest proposal here that I wanted to put out there is to take advantage of what we in the empirical economics community, we call, it's kind of a clunky term, patent paper pairs, knowledge that's disclosed both in the form of scientific publications, but also in patents. And we see that happen quite a bit, especially in biotech, especially for academic research. We can often, when we find a patent, find a twin publication. And the key here is that even if the patents don't report government funding, we can use the publication and information on who funded the publication to sort of back that out. Now, this has been done in a number of examples that we just saw, and a lot of work, so some of the work R.T. Rye and I did years ago. I know KEI has probably gone down this path as well. So this has been done on a case-by-case basis. The idea I have is to try to scale it up using, for lack of a better term, modern data science techniques. So you could take a set of patents, say the whole Orange Book, or all of Moderna's patents, or all mRNA patents, or whatever, find and essentially use the patent paper pair algorithm to identify corresponding papers in PubMed, which is the public database of the biomedical literature. So you find one version of the algorithm is you find publications in PubMed that have the same authors. Typically 2 to 3 author overlap works well. You filter by time, so you don't want patents that are too far away from the publication. And then, and here's the more interesting part, you can compute measures of textual similarity using the title and the abstract. So instead of doing this qualitatively, you can use modern natural language processing techniques to do so. And in this context, unlike many others, you can actually benchmark the performance of this algorithm against known patent paper pairs. So cases where they do report, we can see like what the level of similarity is, what I call alpha here, and then look for things that aren't reported that are above that cutoff alpha. And I think those are the things where you'd want to see further investigation. So there's a lot of advantages of this. I'll talk about disadvantages in a second. One advantage is you can do this at scale. So, you know, if you had some resources, or more importantly, time and skill, you could do this for all biomedical patents in some sense, or all of PubMed actually. And moreover, you can also do this proactively with patent applications. There's no reason you need a patent grant, which might be particularly important in this context. I haven't said anything about COVID, but here's a paper that Fred Ledley and his team at Bentley did. It's actually a preprint that is tracing PubMed publications on the vaccine technologies that are involved in warp speed. And you'll see this, the second column that I've circled here, that, you know, something from 15 to 30% of PubMed publications on these technologies have NIH funding. Well, one natural thing to do, if you think my approach would work, is to find the corresponding patents. So use the pairs algorithm to find the corresponding patents, figure out who owns them, and whatnot. Okay, so that's basically all I have. I'm not a lawyer, but I'll make a patent law joke. It's neither novel nor non-obvious, but perhaps is useful. And I wanted to get other people's thoughts on both the feasibility and desirability of trying to do something like this, but also if someone wants to help, I'd be very happy to collaborate on this. Thanks.
Thank you. That was really a great paper and a great presentation, and really a very good suggestion in terms of the types of things that could be done, not only by researchers, but by the government itself in terms of trying to do a better job of monitoring the issue of the disclosure, but in some cases, not only the legal obligations of disclosure, but looking at the narratives that develop around drug development. Before we go to questions, I just wanted to offer a couple of quick questions. One, normally, I think, as Professor Sampat said, that normally the role of the government's larger in the area of basic research, particularly industry role usually gets bigger as the research is more applied and moving toward clinical trials. That's not always true. And in the case of COVID, antibiotics, and certain health risks, you see actually a fairly deep role by the government, even in late stage clinical trials. So in the COVID context, I think that the general role doesn't really hold. And sometimes it's the opposite. Sometimes you see a bigger role for the government in the late stage in some of these exceptional health risks. Another thing that I think is confusing to a lot of people, not the members of this panel, these panels are really expert on all of these things, but the public sometimes doesn't understand that just because the government funded the technology in some parts of the research and development, it may or may not have legal rights in the patents, that the legal rights are conveyed in a very narrow and technical basis of whether or not the funding was related to an invention. An invention may or may not be the most important part, even of the development process, given the way academics disclose research and the importance of clinical trial funding, for example, which is generally often not patentable at all. That said, the government has various contractual ways that they could exercise rights when they fund research, like in the COVID case. When you give $700 million or $1 billion to a company to pay for the building of a factory or conducting clinical trials, you can certainly put into the contract all kinds of provisions, whether or not you have rights in the patented invention. And that's something that I think most of us have been disappointed has not happened. The NIH used to do more of that through the CRADE agreements. They used to have reasonable pricing clauses in the CRADE. There was an independent right that they'd exercise outside of the patents, for example. Now, I'm sorry for taking everyone's time up, but I'd like to ask the panelists, starting with Sampat, working backwards with Zane, Catherine, and Luis, if you'd like to pose questions to the other panelists. And I'd like you to pose the questions first, and then after the four panelists pose the questions, I'd like to give all the panelists one shot to respond to the questions. And I'd like to start, if you don't mind, Bhavin, with you, if you have a question.
Yeah, for sure. Actually, I have a bunch, but let me pick two. I have one for Luis and I have one for Catherine. And maybe it's Catherine and Zane, actually, because it's on the intersection of your presentations. Luis, you said that there's a lag. There's oftentimes a long lag between when the patent is granted and a certificate of correction. So the question is just, why do they do it? Like what forces them to do it when they do it? And the question for Zane and Catherine is maybe a clarifying question. So the purchase agreements that are going through that ATI, so when I look at, on your tracker, Zane, when I look at, for example, a Moderna contract or another contract that has a procurement in it, you know, the government's also committing to buy 100 million doses. It gets 100 million doses and an option of 300 million. Are those separate from or the same as what's going through ATI? That's the question.
Zane, you're up. You're muted, Zane.
My questions would be to Catherine and Professor Sampath. Catherine, it's fascinating. The ATI thing is really just, it's so bizarre. And I guess I wanted to get a better sense of what the justification you think like really is for going this way. You know, like there's a kind of nominal justification that they're providing you, but like, what do you think is really going on? Like, why do we have this kind of weird intermediary that is, you know, playing a quasi governmental role and then also helping the government evade accountability? So that's my question to you, and then to Professor Sampath. I think it's a pretty fascinating idea. I think I'd be curious to know what, I guess I'd be curious to know what has been done so far, kind of if the patent pairs have been studied empirically in a different way than the one you have provided.
Catherine.
So my question for Zane is, if the US government, and it does seem like you made a very compelling case, does in fact have rights in the Moderna vaccine candidate, on what terms do you think the government should license those rights to Moderna, if Moderna would probably need a license? And for Professor Sampath, I was wondering, do you think that there will always be limitations to a kind of systematic, mechanical way of tracing the patent rights in publicly funded inventions, and how can they be overcome? Or does it need to be kind of organic research as well?
Luis.
Yeah, so to Professor Sampath, so the question is, would the patent papers pair have to have a perfect match in terms of the inventors and the authors? I think there's kind of like a strategic reason why some authors are included in a patent or a paper, and so you will see papers that have more authors than the inventor's name in the patent. So is there a way you can correct for that? I'm guessing that training the database with the project reporter cases will help, but I'm wondering your thoughts on that. And the other thing is there a way to include the SEC form disclosures in the algorithm, because that's a source that we really use a lot of time to find evidence of government funding. So in, you know, it's, the SEC website is quite open data oriented. So I think it would be interesting to include that if possible.
So I'd like to, in terms of the answers, I'd like to start with Professor Bhavan Sampath, and then work backwards to Zane, Catherine, and Luis. So let's start with Professor Sampath.
Great, happy to do so. So great questions. I think I wrote them all down here. So Zane's question: how have pairs been used before? The most common place in which they've been used is to answer a question that may be of interest to people here. The question of how do patents affect follow-on innovation, right? So what people have done, and this is a technique developed by Fiona Murray, who's at MIT now, but essentially to look at when a patent, like, so you have a pair now, which is, you know, essentially the same thing, and she did so by hand. And then what happens to citations to the publication when a patent hits, essentially? Are they effective? And I think she together with Scott Stern found a 6 to 10% decrease or something, but it's research like that. That's the kind of empirical economics research it's been used for. But I'll also comment on Luis's question about inventor overlap, because she took the technique from, I believe, a sociologist of science named Philippe Ducour, who was precisely interested in the difference between the norms of inventorship and the norms of co-authorship. And yeah, so papers often have many more authors than patents do. And I think that does complicate the world a little bit. It's in some sense an empirical question, as you say. Like you can find the right level of overlap that you need, but I think empirically, and you have training sets through which you could do so. But I agree that it's imperfect for that reason. And then let me turn to Catherine's question, because it's related, and this has to do a little with, the question of whether you can, just in general, like whether robots will replace physicians someday, right? Like, or is there still a role for physicians? And in some sense, I think you need both. My sense is that this approach, it might be able to narrow down a set of things that should be examined. In more detail, but for all the reasons that Luis raised and some others as well, it's going to be imperfect. So it can't be the only tool in the arsenal. It's just one of several tools. And what can you do in that case beyond still keep grinding away? I mean, once again, I salute the work KEI has been doing. It's the NIH and other funders should be able to include. I just don't see why you can't compel the grantees and contractors. I don't see a reasonable argument. I try to come up with the trade-offs to every argument, as were in some of my previous slides that I went through. I don't see a reasonable argument for the NIH not proactively forcing grantees and contractors to keep this information. So thank you.
Thank you. Zane.
I think Catherine might be able to speak to this more, but in the database we constructed, for example, it is an aggregate number, and there are some instances where the contracts are they're like two separate agreements that they entered into, so you can't disaggregate. Like the Moderna example, there was a BARDA deal initially, and that BARDA deal was expanded, and so BARDA has done about $1 billion, and then there was an additional supply agreement that they entered into, Operation Warp Speed, which includes the DoD. And so I think in that instance you can disaggregate, and I think maybe I should disaggregate in the database now think about it. But in many of the other deals, like the AstraZeneca one, for example, it's sort of both. They say we're helping them expand manufacturing facilities, and also we're gonna buy 100 million doses or 300 million doses when the time is right.
Catherine.
Yeah, so what Zane said is exactly correct. Many of the agreements are separate. So when the government is funding R&D from like the early stage preclinical research all the way through FDA approval, then it tends to have a separate purchase agreement. So a good example of that is Moderna. But with AstraZeneca and Novavax, the government is funding some very late stage research and scaling up of manufacture and the procurement agreement. So I just presented them as separate, like conceptually, to show the role of Advanced Technology International in the procurement agreements, but sometimes they do overlap. The second question is the rationale for using ATI. And that's a really good question, because it's concerning. If there is no legitimate rationale, then is this just being used to evade oversight and weaken the government's rights in the IP and data? That's a really good question. And the answer that ATI gave to Sydney Lupkin, that NPR reporter, didn't reassure me at all. They said that ATI said that they were using this framework because the membership was already in place. But you can look at the Federal Register to see when people joined the consortium that ATI is facilitating. And Novavax, which is one of the companies that has these huge contracts, joined this summer. So it's not like Novavax is already a member and this is just speeding things along. It's kind of the other way around. So I don't know the rationale. I think that's something that the government should be transparent about.
Thank you, Catherine. Luis.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Sampat, for the question. So you asked, why do patent holders disclose government funding through certificate of correction. I really don't know why, but I'll give you 3 theories that I think are reasonable. Number one is it might just be because they learned that they should have done this, and after the patent was granted, because the technology transfer office told them to. They do. I don't think they do it on a case by case basis, but they do organize this like seminars and trainings, periodically. So maybe patent holders or people that technology transfer people, they learn that they should have disclosed government interest, and then they do it. One way we can, I think, test this theory is by looking into the timing of the Edison disclosure and comparing that to the certificate of correction date. Obviously, the Edison is secret, something that is, we criticize that. Edison should be completely public. And therefore we cannot do that empirical research, but we could, as opposed, look into this thing called the confirmatory licenses, which also tend to have, I think they are correlated with the timing of the Edison disclosure. So if we compare confirmatory license and certificate of correction, we might learn a little bit more about that. The other theory, the other thing is that there is cases where there is some pressure, and those disclosures through certificate of correction, we think, happen because of that pressure. I'll mention one case, which because this year the Global Congress is being organized by Colombian friends. I'll mention the Gleevec case, which is very important and quite frankly infuriating, because for 18 years, Novartis and others failed to disclose government interest, and then they did it to a certificate of correction. And so KEI had been working on government funding around Gleevec for a while, but also we just learned last week that the House Oversight Committee was actually talking to Novartis about government funding around Gleevec and asked them specifically whether there's government funding disclosed. And I analyzed the timing of the correspondence between the House Oversight Committee and Novartis, and it looks like they corrected the record because of things that KI published and questioned that the Oversight Committee was asking. So pressure plays a role. And Gleevec is one example, but there's other, I'll shameless plug here. You can go to KEI's website and look for, in the areas of work, and look for a website that we have on failure to disclose, and you will find several cases. In some occasions, there has been a correction following a letter sent by KEI.
Thank you very much. We had a question from Ken Shadlin. He asked about the Moderna mRNA technology platform and the government rights in the vaccine. And he says, what are the potential rights in other mRNA vaccines? And is this restricted? Is the government's rights restricted Moderna more general? And I think I will just offer my quick take on this, and that is that this is a new platform for vaccines, and I think, and whenever there's sort of some new area of platform, it's concerning about whatever patents are issued, because they may be broad for the development of the technology. They may have application for other diseases, other vaccines within the same disease. It's not related strictly to Moderna. Moderna gets a lot of attention. They've had a massive amount of federal funding, and the president talks them up all the time. But I think it's a more general issue. We have, I think, 3 minutes. I just want to give everyone a chance to say a concluding remark before we stop. I will say one thing. We're going to host a discussion about transparency on October 13th at 3 p.m. Washington, D.C. time. And anyone who wants to, it'll be an open discussion where some of these issues about clinical trial costs, contracts, licenses, and things like that will be discussed. It'll be an informal discussion, unlike this presentation, which was more structured. But for us to wind up the session and to keep the control master happy on this event, I'd like to go through and starting with Louise, I'd like people to give a very short 30-second concluding remarks about the session, and then we're going to have to close it down. Thank you. Louise?
Yeah, just to thank you all the panelists. I've learned a lot here. And second, so on the failure to disclose, I think the NIH budget is $35 billion. That's approximately $35 billion more than like my salary. If we can do this investigation ourselves and find this failure to disclose, the NIH could do that too. BARDA can do it and DARPA can do it, and so they should.
Catherine?
My concluding point is that given the lack of certainty over what's in these agreements because they use the other transactions authority, it is especially important to have transparency of the agreements, and the agreements that we obtained under the FOIA did reveal concerning information about IP and data, but they were heavily redacted, and we appealed the redactions and are pursuing the information in other FOIAs. So we are continuing to pursue transparency as best we can, and stay tuned because this story is not over and there's more to learn about what's going on.
Thank you. Zane?
I would just say we focused a lot on Moderna, but there are, for many different companies, just because of the space we're in, infectious diseases, there's overwhelmingly, immense government support at every stage. And many of the platforms, so for example, the J&J platform, it was originally used for Ebola and they got their Ebola vaccine license. But that process, was underpinned by a lot of NIH money at the early stages. Dan Baruch, I believe that's how you pronounce his name, at Harvard, led some of the work, and he's an NIH-funded scientist. Same with the Merck vaccine. The Merck vaccine, they're developing two, but one of them is literally using the same platform that they had used for their Ebola vaccine, which was developed by Canadian scientists in Winnipeg. And so a lot of these platform technologies have benefited from government investments at many stages, even before the new coronavirus.
Professor Sampath.
To my co-panelists and to you, Jamie, too, keep up the good work. It's useful not only in the real world, but also for academics like myself trying to get a handle on these issues.
Thank you. I think the control master wants me to terminate the session, so I'm going to hit the leave button. I'm not sure if I'm actually have the kill switch or not, but thanks everyone for doing this, and we'll make sure that there's I think there'll be a version of this on YouTube. Thank you.